The record supported this assessment. Humans carried a 38% win rate in sanctioned coalition matches. Respectable, genuinely, for a species that had evolved by chasing prey animals across open grasslands rather than by fighting apex predators with their bare hands. Their best performers leveraged speed, endurance, and what the analysts euphemistically termed unpredictable tactical flexibility, which was a generous way of saying they improvised under pressure in ways that sometimes, occasionally, caught opponents off guard. But against the heavyweights, against the real bruisers from high-gravity worlds, the species that evolution had designed specifically for violence, the fighters who had been competing at the elite level for decades, the results were predictable. The medical interventions were significant. The conversations afterward tended to involve words like courageous and spirited, delivered in the tone people use when they are trying to find something kind to say. We had been watching humans in the arena for 20 cycles. We had no idea what we were looking at. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored non-binary entities. The announcer's voice detonated through the acoustic amplifiers like a controlled explosion, rattling my auditory membranes and sending a visible shudder through the crowd. Welcome to tonight's main event. The response from 60,000 beings was, in clinical terms, unhinged. Tentacles waved. Mandibles clicked in rapid percussion. Sonic screams from 3 separate species hit overlapping frequencies that probably violated municipal noise ordinances in the residential district 2 kilometers away. My Broalian neighbor abandoned all pretense of personal dignity and knocked his elbow directly into my beverage, sending it sloshing. He did not apologize. I do not think he noticed. His 4 eyes were locked on the eastern gate with the focused intensity of someone who had wagered considerably more than was wise. Introducing first, the announcer continued, his voice dropping into theatrical register reserved for fighters being introduced from the 3rd planet of the Sol system, weighing in at 73 kilograms, standing 1.7 meters tall, the human they called a hurricane, Maya Torres. The eastern gate hissed open in a slow hydraulic exhale, and out walked this person. I want to be precise about my initial impression, because it matters for everything that follows. Maya Torres walked into the grand Coliseum of Thikar Prime with a measured, deliberate stride of someone who had made a decision and was simply following through on it, not performing confidence, inhabiting it. There is a difference, and it was immediately visible in the way she moved. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight braid that lay flat against the back of her skull, practical and unadorned, under the arena lights. Her brown skin caught the illumination and gave it back with a warmth that somehow seemed out of place in the Dursteel environment. Her muscles were defined, visibly, impressively defined by human standards, but against the backdrop of what the Coalition considered competitive fighter, they read as decorative, like courting on furniture, present, intentional, ultimately aesthetic. She wore the standard arena equipment. Reinforced shorts, a chest guard of the lightweight composite variety, and hand wraps that extended from her knuckles to just below her elbows. Her face held the expression of someone doing complex arithmetic in their head, jaw set, eyes moving systematically across the arena in a pattern that was clearly not just stage presence. She was scanning, processing, calculating something the rest of us couldn't see. The crowd's reaction to her entrance fell somewhere between polite and patronizing. The human section, not large, occupying perhaps 3% of the total seating, erupted with a disproportionate enthusiasm of people who understood they were outnumbered and had decided to compensate volumetrically. The rest of the arena offered scattered applause, a smattering of appreciative noise, and quite a lot of chuckling. The Broalian beside me wheezed with delighted condescension. She looks like she'd shatter if I sneeze on her, he managed between chuckles. What are they thinking? Putting her in the main event. I did not answer, because the western gate was opening and the temperature in the arena seemed to drop by 5 degrees. Not literally, not physically, but there's a kind of chill that has nothing to do with thermometers, a deep animal recognition of something dangerous entering your space, and 60,000 beings of 40 different species felt it simultaneously as Krellok emerged from the shadows of the western gate and stepped into the light. And his opponent, the announcer said, and even his professional voice carried a note of reverence, the reigning champion of the Coalition heavyweight division, 47 victories, 0 defeats, standing 3.2 meters tall, weighing at 412 kilograms, Krellok the Unbreakable. Now, this was a fighter. Krellok was a Thraxian, and Thraxians were what happened when a planet spent 40 million years making something specifically for the purpose of combat. He had 4 arms, each one a sculpture of functional violence, muscle groups wrapped in layers, cord beneath cords, the whole assembly sheathed in gray, scale-like skin that had the texture and approximate resilience of ceramic plating. His torso was an architecture of natural armor, bone ridges that rose from the surface of his body in overlapping formations, the evolutionary equivalent of full-body shielding that could deflect most conventional weapons and had, on at least 3 documented occasions, caused those weapons to break before the armor did. 2 eyes, black and absolute as deep space, sat above a jaw structure built for crushing. When he crossed the arena floor toward his position, each footfall resonated to the Dursteel with a deep, structural thud that you felt through the soles of your feet in the stands. He did not look at the crowd. He did not perform. He simply walked to his mark with a particular economy of movement that belonged to beings who had never once, in their entire competitive career, doubted the outcome of a fight before it began. The crowd's response was a different creature entirely for what they'd given Maya Torres. This was not polite applause or amused chuckling. This was reverence, the kind of vocal, full-body reverence that sports crowds reserve for the genuinely exceptional. It began in the lower tiers and cascaded upward in a wave, building on itself. 60,000 voices finding a single frequency of awe. I pulled up the betting odds on my data pad with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been making poor financial decisions at sporting events for the better part of 3 centuries. Krellok was favored at 50-1. 50-1. Maya Torres had a 3% probability of victory, according to the algorithmic models, and I strongly suspected those models had included that 3% as a statistical courtesy rather than a genuine assessment. The serious money, the money placed by beings who track fighter statistics professionally, who had connections inside training camps, who approached sports betting with the same cold analytical rigor they brought to commodity futures, was not even wagering on the outcome. That was settled. They were betting on the round, on the method, on whether she would go down to a submission or a knockout, and whether she would be able to walk to the medical bay under her own power afterward. I glanced at the human section. They were standing, every one of them, chanting her name with the fervent, full-throated commitment of people who believed in something completely. They waved flags bearing the blue and white sphere of Earth with conviction that was, under the circumstances, either very admirable or very sad, and I could not quite determine which. The referee, a Caldronian, 4-eyed and famously tolerant of exactly nothing, moved to the center of the arena to deliver the standard protocols. No lethal force. No attacks to sensory organs. Fight to submission, knockout, or medical stoppage. Both fighters approached, received their instructions, returned to their marks. In the crowd, final betting windows closed. The holographic displays shifted to live feed. The atmosphere in the Coliseum had reached a kind of saturation that precedes significant events, a pressure that had nowhere left to build, a silence waiting to become sound. The opening bell rang, a pure crystalline tone that cut through 60,000 voices like light through darkness. And Krellok moved. For something 412 kilograms in mass, he crossed the arena with shocking speed. His 4 arms came up in a fighting stance of immaculate technical form, the kind of form that comes from 47 professional victories and decades of training before that. Perfect balance, perfect weight distribution, perfect menace. He advanced with the measured confidence of a force of nature that has never encountered an obstacle it could not overcome. Maya did not freeze. That was the first thing I noted, and it was important. A great many fighters froze, for 1 breath or 2, when confronted with a heavyweight Thraxian moving toward them with intent. It was a biological response, old as predator-prey relationships, and it could be trained against but rarely entirely eliminated. Maya had eliminated it. She circled immediately, moving left, light on her feet in a way that seemed almost eerie given the disparity in scale, a small boat finding its angle against an incoming tide. Krellok's first strike was a probe, a jab with his upper right arm, fast as a plasma discharge, and probably intended simply to test her reaction time. Maya slipped it by millimeters, her head moving with precisely the minimum displacement necessary, letting the fist pass so close that the displaced air visibly moved her braid. It was good. Technically, it was very good. The crowd made an appreciative noise. Then his lower left arm came sweeping in at body level. The follow-up, the real attack, the thing the jab was setting up, and Maya couldn't dodge it fully. She got her arms up and absorbed the impact in her guard. The force of it sent her skidding backward 3 full meters, her feet scoring friction marks into the Dursteel, and the crowd responded with a roar of confirmation. There it was. There was the mismatch they came to see. Krellok pressed forward without hesitation because he was a professional, and this was what professionals did. He launched into a combination that drew on all 4 limbs simultaneously. High jab, low sweep, middle hook, uppercut. 4 angles of attack arriving in a sequence too rapid and too overlapping for most fighters to process. Fighting Krellok was less like fighting a person and more like fighting a siege engine with multiple targeting systems and decades of operational experience. Maya backpedaled, weaved, ducked low, came back up, blocked where she had to and moved where she could. She was taking hits, glancing strikes that would leave bruises the diameter of dinner plates by the following morning. But she was not going down. After 30 seconds against Krellok, most of his opponents were already reorganizing their plans for what they do during the recovery period. Maya Torres was still on her feet, still moving, still reading. "Look at her," the Broalian murmured beside me, the condescension in his voice shading into something fractionally more complicated, like a minnow trying to navigate around a Leviathan. He laughed, but the laugh was slightly shorter than his previous ones. The 2-minute mark came and went. The betting pools had predicted she'd go down before 5. She was tracking ahead of schedule for disappointing everyone who had wagered on an early finish, which I noted with the detached amusement of someone who had made no bets at all and was therefore free to simply watch. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, Krellok landed a clean body shot. Not full power. You could see the calculation in his movement, the professional judgment that pulled back from force that might cause catastrophic damage to an opponent already operating at a significant disadvantage. But solid enough. The impact drove the air from Maya's lungs and the sound the arena microphones caught and broadcast all 60,000 attendees. A raw, involuntary exhale that carried the weight of physical reality hitting a human body. She doubled over, staggered backward, one hand pressed to her ribs, tried to remember how breathing worked. The crowd surged to its feet, sensing the finish. Krellok advanced with 4 arms spread wide, reading the fight the way champions read every fight. Not cruel, not triumphant yet, simply efficient. Moving to close the distance and end it cleanly. And Maya Torres, still bent forward, still gasping, looked up at it with her eyes and smiled. It was a small smile, tight with pain, strained at the edges, the kind of expression that lives in the gap between what a body is experiencing and what a mind has decided to do about it. But it was unmistakably a smile, and it carried something in it that I could not immediately identify. I should have paid attention to that smile. It was the most important thing that happened in the first half of the fight, and I dismissed it as oxygen deprivation. That was my error. In the rotation to come, I would think about that smile many times, and I would eventually understand what it meant. But in the moment, watching a compromised fighter grin through her pain at the forearm champion bearing down on her, I simply assumed she had momentarily lost touch with her situation. I was wrong about that too. What happened next occupied perhaps 3 seconds of real time, but required 17 separate camera angles and approximately 11 minutes of slow-motion replay before the analysts agreed on what they had witnessed. Krellok moved into his closing sequence with the authority of someone executing a maneuver that had worked 47 times before. He went for what the commentators called a cage grab, using his multiple limbs to envelope an opponent, eliminate their mobility, and pummel them into submission from a position they could not escape. Standard heavyweight finishing protocol. Brutally effective, architecturally simple, perfectly legal. Maya tried to dodge left. Her timing was fractionally wrong. Her ribs were screaming, and her lungs were still negotiating the return to normal function, and Krellok's upper left hand closed around her right forearm with the unyielding certainty of a mechanical clamp engaging. His lower right hand seized her shoulder. He had her. He adjusted his grip. He twisted. The sound reached the upper tiers before the visual did. Because sound carries differently than light in an enclosed structure, and the arena's audio systems amplified everything. A sharp, wet crack, percussive and definitive, the sound of something rigid yielding to force it was not designed to resist. It was audible above 60,000 voices. It cut through the crowd and noise the way a blade finds a gap in armor, specifically, inevitably, with a clarity that made the surrounding noise irrelevant. The holographic medical display above the arena lit red immediately. The imaging system was faster than human reaction time, and it had the fracture mapped and displayed before most of the crowd had processed what they'd heard. Clean break, both bones midshaft. The radius and ulna of Maya Torres' right forearm snapped with a completeness that left no ambiguity and required no interpretation. The crowd's response split cleanly in two directions. Half of them made the sound, that universal cross-species, involuntary intake of breath followed by a wince. The sound of 600 million years of evolution responded to pain that isn't yours. The other half cheered, because they had come for violence, and violence was being delivered. And whatever else the grand Coliseum of Thikar Prime was, it did not pretend to be something more refined than it was. Krellok released of the moment he registered what had happened. Even champions had protocols, and this one was simple. When you hear that sound, you stop. You step back. You let the medical team do their work. He moved away from her with the particular care of someone who has done something significant and is waiting to understand the full weight of it. Maya staggered. The arm hung at an angle that represented a complete departure from human anatomical norms, wrong a way that was visceral to witness even from the upper tiers, even on a being whose physiology you only partially understood. Her face had gone pale in a way that looked less like the pallor of shock and more like her body redirecting all available resources to the problem at hand. Her mouth opened, and the sound that came out of it was not the careful, controlled expression of a fighter acknowledging an injury. It was something older than that, something that lived below training and technique, and the discipline of 20 professional fights. But it lasted only a moment. The referee was already moving, one hand raised to signal the medical team. The scanner drones were descending from their positions near the force barriers, their sensors flooding the immediate area with diagnostic frequencies, their readouts cascading across the holographic display in urgent red cascades. The crowd buzzed with particular energy of anticipated finality. Medical drone, stretcher, medical bay, recovery. This was the sequence. This was how it ended when a bone broke, that audibly, everyone in the Coliseum knew the sequence. The referee reached Maya and looked at her with all four eyes. "Fighter Torres," he said, his voice carrying to the arena audio system with the formal precision of someone delivering a required notification. "Can you continue?" It was a formality. The question existed because the rules required the question, not because anyone expected anything other than the answer that biology and basic physics demanded. You cannot fight with a broken arm. This was not a matter of willpower or competitive spirit. This was structural reality. The arm was non-functional. The nerve damage alone would be debilitating. No fighter in the history of sanctioned coalition combat had ever continued after a fracture of the severity. The question was asked. The answer would be given. The fight would end. The medical team would do their work. The crowd would go home. Maya Torres looked down at her arm. Then she looked at Krellok. Then she looked at the referee. Then this woman, this absolutely, irretrievably unhinged human woman, said, through teeth clenched so hard I could see the jaw muscles working from 40 meters away, "Yes." The referee blinked. All four eyes, sequentially, in the involuntary pattern that Caldronians exhibited when their processing centers encountered information that didn't immediately resolve. "I'm sorry," he said. "What?" "I said yes," Maya replied. Her voice was tight. Pain tight, the kind of tightness that comes from using significant mental effort to filter a very large signal before it reaches your words. But it was steady, disturbingly, inexplicably steady. I can continue. For exactly 2 seconds, the grand Coliseum of Thikar Prime was absolutely silent. Not quiet, not subdued. Silent. 60,000 beings holding their breath with synchronization that no conductor had arranged and no protocol had required. The medical drones flashed their warnings in urgent red. The holographic displays cascaded damage assessments in clinical detail. The referee stood in the center of the arena with the expression of a being whose understanding of the situation had just been surgically removed and replaced with something it didn't recognize. Then, from the human section, someone started chanting her name. Just one voice at first, then two, then the whole section rising together. Maya, 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 a rhythmic insistence that was less a cheer and more a declaration. The sound of people who had decided to believe in something regardless of what the evidence suggested, and who were not interested in being talked out of it. The referee straightened. He was professional, and he had regulations. And the regulations were clear on this point. A fighter who was conscious, coherent, and verbally confirmed their ability to continue retain the right to do exactly that. He was not empowered to override that decision based on his own assessment. The rules were the rules, and the rules existed precisely because these situations were complicated. He looked at Maya anyway, with the expression of someone who would very much like the rules to say something different. "Fighter Torres," he said carefully, "I am required to inform you that continuing with this injury is medically inadvisable and carries significant risk of permanent career-ending damage." "Noted," Maya said, and her voice had found something on the other side of pain. Not beyond it. She was not performing the absence of pain. She was performing the irrelevance of it, which was a very different and considerably more alarming thing. "I'm not forfeiting." The referee's mandibles clicked once, sharply, in the call-to-knee expression of profound exasperation. He looked at the medical drones. He looked at the official's box, where 3 league representatives were engaged in frantic tablet-based consultation that would produce, ultimately, nothing actionable, because the rules said what they said. He looked back at Maya, who was doing something that required a moment to parse. She was adjusting her stance. She had taken her broken arm, the arm that the holographic display was describing in urgent clinical language involving words like displace, compromise, and requires immediate intervention, and tucked it carefully against her body, protecting it against further impact. And she had raised her left arm into a guard position. One arm, a single functional guard, raised and ready. She was going to fight Krellok the Unbreakable, 47 victories and 0 defeats, with one arm. And she was doing it not because she had lost her grip on reality, but because she had made a calculation that the rest of us were not yet equipped to follow. The Broalian beside me had stopped laughing. He was staring at the arena floor with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not amusement, not condescension, not excitement. Something more complicated. Something that lived in the space between certainty and its absence. "She's lost her mind," he muttered, almost to himself. "The pain has broken something." And watching her set her stance with that single raised fist, watching her find her balance with the particular focus of someone who has reduced the problem to its essential components and is now solving only what remains, found that I could not quite bring myself to agree with him. Not because I thought she could win. I did not think she could win. The mathematics were clear, and the mathematics were overwhelming. But there was something in the way she was standing that did not look like a malfunction. It looked like a decision. The referee stepped back. His duty was discharged. He could not protect her from herself, and the rules did not ask him to. The medical drones retreated to standby positions, their warnings still flickering on the display above, unresolved and persistent. The fight was not over. Across the arena floor, Krellok stood and looked at Maya Torres with an expression I had never seen on a Thraxian face before. His black eyes were still, and the stillness of them was a different kind of stillness than his usual pre-strike composure. He was, and I do not use this word lightly when describing a four-armed heavyweight champion who had never lost a fight in his professional life, uncertain. "Human," he said, and his voice carried through the arena audio system with a depth that resonated in the lower registers. His translator rendered it in careful galactic standard, but the emotion in it needed no translation. "This is foolish. Surrender with honor. There is no shame in it." Maya Torres looked at him across the arena floor. She spit blood onto the Dursteel, a small gesture, practical rather than theatrical, clearing her mouth, and raised her left fist a fraction higher. "Come on then," she said. "Oh." I knew that tone. Not from Maya specifically. I had never met a human before in any personal capacity. But I knew that tone the way you know certain sounds that evolution has wired into your nervous system before you were born. It was a tone of someone who had passed through fear and pain and arrived somewhere on the other side, somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary persuasion. Someone who had made a decision at a level below language, a level below conscious choice, and was now simply following through. The bell for round 2 rang. What followed was something that the analyst would spend weeks attempting to describe, with limited success, using the vocabulary that sports commentary had developed over centuries. That vocabulary was adequate for most things. It was not adequate for this. Krellok approached more cautiously than he had in the first round, and the caution itself was remarkable. A 400-kilogram champion who had never needed to be cautious, recalibrating his approach to a fighter who was operating at significantly below full capacity. Maya circled clockwise this time, the opposite direction from before, keeping her broken arm away from his dominant striking hand, moving with a lightness that seemed paradoxically increased by the loss of her right arm's function. Less weight to manage. Simpler geometry. She had reduced herself to what was essential, and was moving from that reduced foundation with a clarity that her fully intact first round had not quite achieved. Krellok threw a testing jab. Maya slipped it, clean, minimal, technically precise, and countered immediately with a left hook that caught him on the ribs. The sound of her fist connecting with his armor plating was a dull, muted thud, the sound of a thrown stone against stone. It did nothing to his physiology that could be measured by the holographic medical readout. His hide did not dent. His breathing pattern did not change. His ribs were armored by bone formations that made the concept of bruising irrelevant. But she had hit him. She had slipped his jab, moved into range, and thrown a technically sound counterstrike with her one functional arm. And she had landed it, one-armed, broken, in obvious pain. She had landed a counterstrike on the reigning Coalition heavyweight champion. The crowd's energy changed. It was subtle. The way atmospheric pressure changes before a significant weather event, a shift you feel in your secondary senses before your primary ones have registered it. The roar that had been building since the fight took on a different texture, less celebratory, more focused. The betting terminals, which I had been monitoring with the detached interest of someone who had placed no money and therefore had no personal stake, began registering unusual activity. Not a flood of bets on Maya Torres, no one predicting a victory yet, but hedging, recalibration. People who had bet on Krellok winning in the first 5 minutes quietly adjusting their exposure, not because they doubted the ultimate outcome, but because whatever was happening on the arena floor had moved outside the range of their models. Krellok escalated. His frustration was a professional frustration, not the hot, irrational kind, but the colder variety that comes from applying the correct tools to a situation and not getting expected results. He launched a combination that drew on all 4 limbs, designed to overwhelm a defense that was limited to a single arm, designed to be unanswerable. It was technically unanswerable. Maya did not answer it. She moved instead, ducking under the high strike with a timing that was either brilliantly calculated or suicidally optimistic, rolling away from the low sweep in a way that put her momentarily on the floor before she came back to her feet, backpedaling from a charging grab with the footwork of someone who has accepted that they cannot stop what is coming and has therefore decided to simply not be there when it arrives. She was taking glancing hits throughout this, impacts that would leave their documentation on her body in shades of purple and blue and yellow for weeks afterward. Strikes that she could not fully avoid and was not trying to fully avoid, calculating instead which fraction of each blow she could redirect, absorb, survive. She was not defending. She was managing, a word that does not appear in most combat training manuals, but which described precisely what she was doing, maintaining the conditions necessary for the fight to continue while she worked on something else entirely. By the 7-minute mark, I had leaned so far forward in my seat that the Broalian's fermented kelp scent was registering as background rather than assault. My forgotten beverage had rolled off the seating arm and was somewhere beneath us, and I had not noticed when it happened. Maya Torres was not surviving anymore. She was fighting. The distinction matters. Surviving is reactive, responding to what is done to you, managing the damage, staying upright by refusing to go down. Fighting is active, reading the situation, developing understanding, and acting on that understanding with intent. Maya had crossed from one to the other somewhere around the 6-minute mark, and the crossing had been so quiet that I had missed the exact moment. But the evidence was now visible to anyone who was watching closely enough, and by the 7-minute mark, everyone in the Coliseum was watching closely enough. She had learned Krellok's patterns. Not all of them. He had too much experience and too much tactical range for 20 minutes of observation to decode completely, but enough. The slight forward shift of his upper right shoulder that preceded his most powerful strike. The half-breath pause between combination sequences where he reset his balance. The way his lower arms telegraphed their movements marginally later than his upper arms, creating a brief window of predictability in his attacks that a sufficiently attentive and sufficiently desperate opponent might exploit. She was exploiting it. A left cross caught Krellok on the jaw. Not a glancing blow. A properly directed strike that found the gap between his armor plating at the angle where the jawline met the throat structure, in a spot that even Thraxian biology had not seen fit to reinforce with bone. His head snapped sideways. The movement was small, centimeters, not meters, well within the range of normal human head movement, and therefore genuinely startling on a Thraxian. But it was visible from the upper tiers, and the entire arena saw it. The crowd's gasp was one of the most distinctive sounds I had ever heard in 60,000 seasons of attending various events. Not a roar, not a cheer, a gasp, a single, involuntary, synchronized intake of 60,000 breaths. Maya followed immediately with a knee strike to his midsection, targeting with surgical precision the gap between two armor ridge formations where the plating did not fully overlap, a gap that would not be visible to casual observation, but that she had apparently been mapping for the past 7 minutes, while everyone else was watching her bleed. Krellok grunted, a deep, structural sound that his body produced involuntarily, the sound of a defensive system encountering something it hadn't prepared for, and stepped backward. The Broalian next to me started to say something and stopped. He started again and stopped again. His translator, rendering all of this in faithful galactic standard, produced 2 fragments and then silence. Did she just... silence? She just... silence. Yes, she just made Krellok the Unbreakable step backward. The holographic probability displays, which had been flickering with increasing computational uncertainty for the past several minutes, now began cycling through calculations at a rate that suggested their algorithms were encountering something outside their parametric range. The odds board shifted. 50-1 became 40-1, then 35, the numbers updating in small, stunned increments that reflected not a genuine belief in Maya's victory, but the pure mathematical acknowledgement that something was happening that the models had not accounted for. In the press box, the commentary team had abandoned their prepared material entirely. One of the senior analysts was repeating a single phrase in a loop, the way beings sometimes do when their processing has hit a constraint. That shouldn't be possible. That shouldn't be possible. That shouldn't. Krellok's fighting had changed in character. The composure that had carried him through 47 victories. The cold, technical precision of a champion who had never needed to doubt himself. Was developing fractures. His attacks were escalating in force and decreasing in technical precision. The 2 changes moving in inverse proportion to each other in a way that they always did when frustration replaced calculation. He was putting more power into strikes that Maya was no longer in position to receive. He was committing to charges that she was stepping away from at angles he hadn't predicted. He was doing something that no opponent in 47 fights had ever made him do. He was making mistakes. Maya ducked under a haymaker that would have taken her head off at the shoulders had it landed, and as she came back up into her fighting position, for just a moment, I saw her face clearly on the holographic display, rendered in high-definition detail for 60,000 spectators. She was smiling, not the pained, defiant smile from earlier in the fight. A different smile, wider, more present. The smile of someone who is in the middle of something they are very, very good at and who knows it. She was enjoying herself. The arena had become something different from what it had been when the opening bell rang. The atmosphere had undergone a transformation that I could feel in the air and see in the posture of every being around me. The Broalian had stopped recording on one of his 3 devices because he had forgotten it was in his hand and put it down without noticing. Beings in adjacent sections were talking to each other in urgent undertones, pointing, gesturing, attempting to describe what they were seeing to each other as if naming it might help them understand it. The human section had been joined by a growing contingent from other species sections, beings who had simply migrated toward the place where the most significant thing in the Coliseum was happening. At the 10-minute mark, Maya's broken arm was still broken. This was not going to change. The holographic medical readout was not going to update to reflect the spontaneous recovery. The anatomy was what it was, and she had been fighting for 10 full minutes with that anatomy, fighting at maximum output, absorbing strikes that the readout was cataloging in an ever-growing list, cracked ribs, bruising across significant portions of her body, what the medical drones were carefully describing as soft tissue damage in her functioning shoulder from the additional load it was carrying. None of this had stopped her. Krellok charged. A genuine charge now, not a calculated advance. All four arms extended with the kind of committed force that had ended 7 of his fights before the judges had needed to render a decision. He was abandoning strategy in favor of overwhelming physics. The basic principle that 400 kilograms of moving mass was ultimately more persuasive than anything technique could offer. Maya waited. She let him commit to the charge fully, waited for the point of no return where his momentum was irrecoverable, and then she moved. She dropped low, below the level of his extended arms, and drove forward rather than retreating, directly into the space where his legs were, into the center of the charge rather than away from it. She came through and between his legs, twisting as she went, using the momentum he had generated as part of her own movement rather than opposing it. She came up behind him. She drove her left foot into back of his knee joint with every ounce of force remaining in her body, targeting the one point on the Thraxian's lower body where the armor ridge formations did not provide complete coverage. The joint itself, where flexibility required a structural compromise. His knee buckled. Not fully. His mass was too great, and his reflexes too good for her to take him down from behind. But enough, a visible, structural buckle, a momentary interruption in his stability that had no precedent in 47 fights. The sound the crowd made was not a roar. It was beyond that. It was a sound that had not been planned or coordinated, that required no common language or shared species, that emerged from 60,000 beings simultaneously, because 60,000 beings were witnessing the same impossible thing at the same moment, and their bodies were responding to it in the only way available to them. The atmospheric shield above the arena registered the acoustic impact. The structural monitors in the Coliseum's support columns detected the vibration. Somewhere in the crowd, 3 beings fainted from the sheer physiological overload of sustained extreme emotion. Krellok stumbled, caught himself, turned, and what I saw on his face in that moment, broadcast in high definition on every holographic display in the arena, rendered in detail for 60,000 spectators, recorded on approximately 50,000 personal devices, was something I had not expected and had no ready framework for. The black eyes that had never registered doubt through 47 consecutive victories were registering something now. Not fear, exactly. Not confusion, exactly. Something that lived between them. The expression of a mind encountering a situation that all previous experience has failed to prepare for. Krellok was looking at Maya Torres and finding that he did not know what she was. 12 minutes. The arena had been transformed from a sporting venue into something closer to a shared psychic event. Every being present was operating at the edge of their capacity for sustained emotional response, the kind of state that usually required religious experience or species-level crisis to produce. No one was sitting. No one was checking their data pads. No one was paying attention to anything in the Coliseum except the 60-meter circle of Dursteel on the floor below and the 2 figures on it. Maya's left arm had to be reaching its limits. Biology was not abstract. Human muscles operated within constraints that no amount of determination could permanently override, and she had been driving that arm at maximum output for 12 straight minutes, while her body managed the catastrophic pain signals from her broken arm and her cracked ribs and her compromised shoulder and the accumulated impact of every strike she'd absorbed that she hadn't been able to fully avoid. She was running on something that wasn't on the medical readout, something the drones couldn't measure, something that the analytical models hadn't included in their probability calculations, because it wasn't the kind of variable that fit cleanly into columns. Krellok roared, not a combat vocalization. This was different, deeper, something from an older registered Thraxian communication, the sound that his species had used across evolutionary history to announce an intent so total that it bypassed rational opposition and spoke directly to the instinctive mind. It was a sound of overwhelming force as language. It was a sound that had, across millions of years and countless encounters, caused prey animals to abandon the field. He launched himself forward with all four arms extended, abandoning every technique that had served him for 47 fights, reducing himself to the final and most fundamental argument available to a being of his mass and power, sheer, total, irresistible force. Maya did not retreat. She stepped forward, into the charge, into the space where his mass and momentum were most concentrated, inside the reach of his arms, closer than any rational fighter would go to a Thraxian in full committed attack. She was in the most dangerous place in the arena, the eye of it, and she moved there not because she had lost her judgment, but because she had made a calculation that the rest of us were, at that moment, only beginning to understand. Time moved differently in those final seconds. This is a common description of high-stakes moments, and I have always treated it as a figure of speech. I understand now that it is not. In extreme conditions, when every sensory system you possess is operating at full capacity and directing all available processing toward a single focus, the subjective experience of time genuinely expands. Details become available that ordinary speed would conceal. I saw her feet find their positions. I saw the pivot on her left foot, the rotation of her hips, the alignment of her body into a single kinetic chain from the ball of her foot through her hip, through her shoulder, through her arm. I saw the geometry of it, the physics of it, assembled in the space of a moment with a precision that could only come from something that had been prepared for a very long time, lying in wait behind everything that had preceded it. She drove her left fist into Krellok's solar plexus. One arm, no momentum from her right side, no counterbalancing force. Just a single-limb total commitment of everything she had remaining, directed at the one anatomical point where even Thraxian physiology encountered limitation. The solar plexus complex, buried beneath the armor ridges, accessible only from the precise angle that she had spent the last 4 minutes maneuvering him into position to reveal. The impact sounded like a hammer connecting with a resonance chamber, not the dull thud of strike against armor, but a deep, structural note that suggested something had transferred. Something had moved from her body into his. Something that the armor ridges had not been positioned to deflect. Krellok's eyes went wide. All the air left his lungs simultaneously, forced out by a physiological response that he could not control and had never trained against, because the kind of strike that would cause this response was not the kind of strike that had ever been delivered to him before. His 4 arms dropped to his sides. His knees bent under his own weight. And then Krellok, holder of 47 victories, undefeated champion of the Coalition heavyweight division, the being that 400 years of Thraxian evolution had produced the specific purpose of being exactly what he was, fell. He went down the way structures go down. First a tremor, then a lean, then the irreversible commitment of mass to gravity. To his knees first, the Dursteel resonating with the impact, then forward, his full mass connecting with the arena floor in a single extended boom that the structural monitors registered, that the crowd felt through their feet, that seemed to reverberate outward to the walls of the Coliseum and into the city beyond. The arena fell silent, not the silence that precedes something, the silence that follows something, the silence of 60,000 beings who had just witnessed an event that their existing frameworks cannot yet accommodate, who are in the gap between experience and understanding, in the place before language arrives to describe what the senses have received. The referee moved. The medical drones descended. The holographic display ran its scan. Alive, conscious, vital signs stable, unable to continue. The referee turned to the arena, raised his hand, and made the signal that the rules designated for the specific outcome. His 4 eyes were visible on the holographic display overhead, and they held an expression that I recognized as a professional face that experienced officials learn to maintain over circumstances they have never rehearsed for. Maya Torres had won. 2 seconds of silence. Then the Coliseum came apart. The sound was not a roar. A roar was too small a word, too familiar, too containable. This was 60,000 beings releasing 12 minutes of accumulated tension in a single simultaneous expression, and it had a physical component, vibration, pressure, a wave of force that moved through the air and the structure and the bodies of everyone present. Beings through things they were holding, because the impulse to gesture was stronger than the impulse to maintain possession. 3 separate individuals in Section 47 fainted. A Zen-3 vendor had abandoned his station and was simply standing in the middle of the concourse, making a sound that his translator rendered as an approximate vowel. The Broalian beside me was crying. I want to be precise about this, because I spent a moment doubting my own perception. He was crying, actual tears running down his face and into his secondary gill folds, which must have been physiologically uncomfortable in a way he was clearly not registering. His merchandise had spilled across both our laps at some point during the final exchange, and neither of us had noticed, and neither of us cared. He was crying and looking at the arena floor, and making a sound that his translator was too overwhelmed to render coherently. In the center of the arena, Maya Torres was standing, still standing, cradling her broken arm against her chest, listing slightly to one side as the adrenaline that had been holding her vertical began its inevitable withdrawal, and she was still smiling. Not the defiant smile from the early rounds, not the focused smile from the middle of the fight. This was something quieter, something that belonged to a person who had finished doing something very difficult and was, for a single unguarded moment, simply present in the fact of it. The medical teams descended in coordinated swarms. 3 simultaneous deployments. 1 for Krellok, who was being assisted at his feet by 4 support staff, and who wore the expression of a being who has just been handed information that fundamentally revises everything he understood about himself. 1 for Maya, who was allowed herself, finally, to acknowledge what her body had been communicating to the entire fight. Sitting as the medics reached her, her legs giving out in the gentle, relieved way that muscles give out when they're told they are no longer needed. And 1 team standing in reserve near the crowd barrier, positioned in case of sustained emotional intensity, produced medical events among the spectators, which, as it happened, it did, in 3 documented cases. The medical readout for Maya Torres was not a document that would be used to reassure anyone. Fractured forearm, both bones, 3 cracked ribs, severe bruising across approximately 70% of her body surface. Concussion, mild to moderate. Shoulder muscle tears from the compensatory load. Dehydration. The list extended beyond what could be captured in a single display frame. She was placed on a regeneration stretcher with the careful, practiced movements of medics who understood that the being they were handling had just done something unprecedented. As they secured her, the human section, which had long since breached the security barriers and flooded toward the arena floor, and which security had apparently decided to allow, because the alternative was arresting 60 people on legitimate grounds that no one in the building felt good about, surrounded her in a mass of people who were crying and laughing and speaking a language I didn't understand in tones that required no translation. She said something to them. I couldn't hear it from my position, but the holographic display caught it. A few words, quietly delivered, and then that smile again, and then she settled back against the stretcher and closed her eyes. The betting booths had entered a state that the systems were not designed to handle gracefully. The payout calculations for 50-to-1 bets at Coalition main event stakes were producing numbers that the standard processing architecture was treating with visible skepticism, cycling through verification sequences with a repetition that suggested computers were asking the numbers to confirm themselves before committing. Several bookmakers had simply sat down and were staring at nothing. A Zen-3 trader, a being of significant means and profound financial acuity who had, by his own later account, placed his bet on Maya Torres as an ironic gesture, a joke he was making at the absurdity of the odds, was standing in front of his terminal reading his winning ticket with the expression of a person who has opened a door they expected to find a closet behind and discovered instead an entire other country. I was joking, he was apparently saying repeatedly. I was joking. I was joking. The replay screens were running the final sequence from 17 angles simultaneously, the different perspectives cascading across the holographic displays above the arena in a mosaic of the same 3 seconds viewed from every available vantage point. Frame by frame, quarter speed, 8th speed, 16th. The analysts who had appeared on the commentary feeds within minutes of the final bell were using language that their profession had not previously required them to use. Unprecedented, impossible, inexplicable, the kind of words that analytical vocabulary treats as defeats. One thing emerged from the analysis that settled into the commentary, like a weight. The final strike had been planned, not in the last 30 seconds, not as a desperation move. From roughly the 8-minute mark, Maya had been positioning Krellok, incrementally, patiently, one exchange at a time, toward the specific stance and the specific angle and the specific moment of committed forward charge that would create the single window of access to the target she needed. She had been playing a 12-minute game while appearing to be simply surviving. The broken arm had not changed the plan. It had only changed the arm. The medical shuttle departed with Maya Torres at 42 minutes past the final bell. She left to the sound of 60,000 beings who were still in the Coliseum because no one had quite been able to bring themselves to leave yet, and who sent her off with a sound that was not applause in any recognizable form, but which served the same function, an acknowledgement, extended and genuine, of something that deserved to be acknowledged. Krellok received his treatment, emerged from the medical station under his own power, and stood for a moment at the edge of the arena floor. The crowd, to their credit, gave him something real, not the consolation applause of an audience that has already moved on, but the recognition of a being who had been excellent for a very long time, who had faced something excellent, and who had the dignity to meet the outcome without qualification. He looked at the arena once. He looked at the space where Maya had been standing. Then he walked away, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it. I left the Coliseum at nearly the last moment, trailing the final stragglers from Section 47 into the concourse, and out through the main gates into the thicker night air. The Broalian merchant, who had stopped crying but whose face retained the residual evidence of it, walked beside me for a few steps without speaking. Then he stopped, turned back toward the Coliseum, and looked at it for a long moment. "I've been coming here for 60 cycles," he said to no one in particular. "I've never seen anything like that." He went one direction. I went another. I have spent considerable time since that night thinking about what I witnessed in the Grand Coliseum of Thikar Prime, and I have arrived at a conclusion that is both simple and uncomfortable. Simple, because it does not require elaborate analysis. Uncomfortable, because it requires revising a significant number of assumptions that I and most of the Galactic Coalition have been operating under for 20 years. Humans are not the strongest species. They are not the fastest, the most durable, the most naturally armored, or the most inherently built for combat. Their bones are calcium phosphate compounds that fracture under sufficient force. Their skin is soft enough to be pierced by objects that most species would not classify as weapons. Their physiology is optimized for an environment and a way of life that did not involve fighting creatures significantly larger than themselves, and it shows. But here's the thing about evolution that the Coalition had been misreading. It is not primarily interested in making things strong. It is interested in making things survive. And the mechanisms it developed in humanity for survival are not the obvious ones. Not armor, not venom, not claws, not enhanced healing. They are psychological, cognitive, something in the architecture of the human mind that appears, under sufficiently extreme conditions, to simply decline the offered defeat. Other species have pain thresholds. Humans have a different relationship with pain entirely. Not a threshold beyond which they stop, but a negotiation, a running conversation between the signals their body generates and the decisions their mind makes about what to do with those signals. And in certain individuals, under certain conditions, that negotiation produces outcomes that the signals themselves would not predict. Maya Torres walked into the Grand Coliseum with a 3% probability of victory and won. She did it with a broken arm, cracked ribs, and the full awareness of every being in the building, including, almost certain herself, that she was supposed to lose. She did it through 12 minutes of sustained extreme pain against an opponent who outweighed her by a factor of 5, by doing a thing that no algorithmic model had accounted for. She kept thinking. She kept learning. She kept planning. She fought through the crisis of the broken arm, not by ignoring the crisis, but by integrating it into a plan that the crisis itself had not disrupted. And she smiled while she did it. That smile, the first one, the one I saw when she was doubled over and gasping and Krellok was advancing to finish the fight, was not delirium. I understand that now. It was recognition. She had seen something in the way he was moving, something in the pattern she had been accumulating for 2 minutes of close-range observation, and the smile was the moment she understood how the rest of the fight could go. She was, at the point when most beings in the arena believed the fight was over, the only person in the building who knew it wasn't. The Galactic Coalition had been watching humans in the arena for 20 cycles, treating them as charming underdogs, warm-up acts, a novelty species playing a competition with the serious fighters. We had been measuring them by the wrong instruments. We had been looking at their biology and concluding that it defined their ceiling, when in fact the most relevant part of what they were had nothing to do with biology at all. I do not know what to do with this information in any complete sense. I have been sitting with it for a long time, and I am not certain it is the kind of information that fully resolves. It opens outward rather than inward. If this is what a human fighter does in a sporting arena against a single opponent with medical teams standing by and regulations preventing lethal force, if this is a contained, sanctioned, supervised expression of whatever it is they are, then what does the uncontained expression look like? What does that particular relationship with impossibility produce when the stakes are real in a way that a gladiatorial contract is not? I asked a human that question once, sometime after Thikar Prime. She looked at me for a moment and then said something I have carried with me since. We've been asking ourselves the same question, she said, for as long as we've been human. Never underestimate a human who smiles when they should be screaming. That smile is not bravado. It is not delusion. It is not the absence of understanding. It is the presence of a different kind of understanding, the kind that looks at impossible odds and finds, somewhere in the arithmetic of the situation, a way through that everyone else has stopped looking for. Maya Torres taught 60,000 beings that lesson on the floor of the Grand Coliseum of Thikar Prime. The galaxy, I suspect, is still learning what it means. I have witnessed a great many stupid things in my 300 cycles of existence. I have watched Voltherian politicians stand at podiums and promise sweeping tax reforms with the kind of straight-faced sincerity that would make a carnival huckster blush. I have seen Krennic's traders attempt to peddle ice to frost dwellers on the moons of Jelhari. I once watched my own broodmate, in a moment of spectacular overconfidence, attempt to microwave a plasma core. The resulting explosion took out 2 walls and most of his dignity. I thought I had seen it all. I genuinely, truly believed that the universe had exhausted its capacity to surprise me. I was wrong. Nothing, not the politicians, not the traders, not the smoldering crater where my broodmate's kitchen used to be, could have prepared me for what I witnessed in the Grand Coliseum of Thikar Prime on that rotation. Not in 1,000 more cycles of living would I have predicted it. And I have spent considerable time since then trying to articulate exactly what I saw, because some events refuse to be contained by ordinary language. Some things you witness with your own eyes and still do not fully believe. Let me try anyway. The Grand Coliseum of Thikar Prime was not merely an arena. That word, arena, implies something simple, something contained. A pit, a ring, a designated space for control violence. The Coliseum was something else entirely. It was a monument, a cathedral of spectacle that had been standing for centuries, its reinforced superstructure rising toward the atmospheric shield like a declaration of intent. From the outside, it dominated the thicker skyline, the way a predator dominates a landscape, not by being the loudest thing present, but by making everything else seem smaller simply through proximity. On the night in question, every one of its 60,000 seats was occupied. When I say occupied, I do not mean pleasantly full, the way a restaurant might be on a busy evening. I mean packed with a density that made the recycled air feel personal. 60,000 beings from 40 distinct species, pressed into tiered seating that spiraled upward in great concentric rings toward the shimmering dome of the atmospheric shield far above. To look up from the arena floor must have been like staring into the eye of a living galaxy, a swirling mass of bodies, colors, appendages, and noise that seemed to pulse with its own collective heartbeat. The smell, predictably, was extraordinary. Overpriced nutrient paste in 17 different formulations. Recycled oxygen that carried faint notes of mechanical filtration. The musk of 40 different species pressed close together, each contributing their own olfactory signature to the cumulative atmosphere. And beneath all of it, threading through everything like an invisible current, that electric tension that makes your secondary gills flare open without your permission. The anticipation smell. Primordial, irresistible, the scent of something significant about to happen. Above the fighting floor, holographic displays the size of small buildings cycle through fighter statistics, betting odds, anatomical readouts, and sponsor advertisements with cheerful indifference to the magnitude of what they were previewing. The fighting floor itself gleamed under the arena lights, a 60-meter circle of reinforced Dursteel, its surface scuffed and scored by decades of combat, bordered by force barriers that hummed at a frequency you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. The whole structure breathed with readiness, like a held breath waiting to release. My seat was in the upper third tier, section 47, wedged between the structural pillar and my seatmate for the evening, a Broelian merchant of considerable girth who smelled powerfully of fermented kelp and who had apparently decided that personal space was a concept that applied to other people. He had 3 recording devices arranged in a fan around his seating pod and had been narrating his own commentary into the middle one since before I arrived. His translator rendered his running monologue in crisp Galactic standard whether I wanted it to or not. I settled in, ordered a beverage at a price that briefly made me reconsider my financial priorities, and pulled up the match statistics on my data pad. Tonight's main event. Let me explain something about gladiatorial combat in civilized space, because people outside the Coalition sometimes have misconceptions shaped by sensationalist feeds and historical dramas that mistake spectacle for savagery. The modern arena was a regulated, licensed, medically supervised enterprise. Every fighter signed comprehensive contracts. Every match had certified medical teams stationed at ringside with equipment sophisticated enough to repair most injuries sustained during competition. Lethal outcomes were exceedingly rare, not impossible, but rare enough that they occupied the same statistical territory as shuttle accidents and spontaneous atmospheric decompression. The fighters were professionals. The venues were accountable. The whole apparatus was monitored by the Galactic Athletic Coalition's Oversight Division with a bureaucratic thoroughness that occasionally bordered on the absurd, none of which made it any less brutal. It simply made it a regulated brutality, which somehow felt more honest than pretending otherwise. Humans have been participating in sanctioned arena combat for approximately 20 cycles, ever since their species completed the formal integration process and joined the broader coalition. In that time, the general consensus among seasoned fight fans, the kind of beings who track statistics, analyze footage, and could recite fighter records the way some species recite religious texts, had solidified into something remarkably consistent. Humans were charming. Humans were plucky. Humans were hopelessly, endearingly, almost poignantly outmatched. They made excellent opening acts. Warm-up entertainment before the serious bouts. Betting practice for amateurs who wanted to get their eye in before the real odds mattered. Coaches from other species occasionally cited human fighters in training seminars, not as examples to emulate, but as illustrations of the limits of heart and technique when not supported by sufficient biology. Humans generated sympathy the way certain small animals did. You rooted for them, you winced when they lost, and you move on having felt approximately nothing was at stake.